Welcome to News from Neptune for February 21st in the 8th week of 2020. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, said, quote, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. With the help of J.B. Nicholson's research, David Green and I will try to say some true things today on a Stone the Crows edition of News from Neptune. Stone the Crows is a peculiar Australian expression that really comes from the fact that crows attack lambs on sheep farms in Australia. So Stone the Crows was a defensive move, one might say. It's reported this morning that
I'm sure it will become more clear.
I hope it will become more clear. I want to talk about Roger Stone and what the Crows are doing.
Oh, I see. Stone.
Picking at this particular lamb, and so the Australian phrase. None of the people involved are Australian in any way at all.
Okay.
But the Australian phrase occurred to me as I thought about how Stone was being crowed, so to speak. Interesting things going on. I just before we started to record, I was reading a note from CBS that the sudden change in the Director of National Intelligence in the U.S. arises from the fact that the former acting Director of National Intelligence allowed one of his subordinates to tell House lawmakers that Russia appears to favor him, that is Trump, in the 2020 election. Now, we have a number of things working here, including the residual Russiagate phenomenon, which is basically a Clintonian phenomenon in the American government, particularly in the so-called intelligence community. And since that's what I'm going to be talking about in regard to Roger Stone, I thought I would mention this late-breaking news. The best account of the Stone business comes from an interesting fellow himself, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig, not exactly a plum assignment, I think, Craig Murray. Craig Murray is a very interesting fellow who has been writing about British politics in various ways since he was relieved of his ambassadorship by the last British government. Murray writes about the Stone sentencing, the sentencing of Roger Stone that occurred this week in the U.S., of course, but he writes about it from the account being given by the Guardian newspaper. The Guardian newspaper in London is the equivalent, for good or ill, for good and ill, of the New York Times and the Washington Post. That is a rabidly anti-Trump political establishment newspaper giving the views of the upper reaches of British publishing, which are very much in accord with the interests of the British 1% and the American 1%, or in fact associated one with another. The Guardian newspaper, writes Murray, has taken the art of obfuscation, false implication, and the subtler forms of journalistic lying to new heights in its very extensive coverage of the Roger Stone sentencing saga. Does that sound familiar? I mean, if you've been paying attention to what the New York Times and Washington Post have been doing for a generation and more, it may be. Murray approaches the matter through the actions of the Guardian newspaper, a clone to the American establishment press. The Guardian has now devoted 14 articles in the last fortnight Fortnight is British for 2 weeks, 14 articles in 2 weeks.
Never could understand why they keep saying that.
In other words, an article a day. It has now devoted 14 articles in the last fortnight to this rather obscure episode of American political history. It is an obscure episode, but I think it points up a lot of the things we've been dealing with recently in American political history. Murray continues, yet not one of those Guardian articles, nor in more than a dozen articles about the Stone case that preceded it over the last few months, has the Guardian informed its readers what Stone was actually convicted of doing. That's true for a remarkable number of Americans. In my email, in my incoming email, I've got good liberals saying things like, I hope Stone dies in jail from bad food. Someone did say that. Why the hatred of Roger Stone? And the answer is because we are affected by Trump derangement syndrome for the benefit of the Russia-gators. Stone was convicted of giving false testimony and misleading the FBI because he claimed to be a conduit between WikiLeaks and Trump when he was not. There was no conduit between WikiLeaks and Trump. Stone was also convicted of witness intimidation because once his fantasies got him into trouble, he tried to browbeat my friend Randy Credico. Randy Credico is an American comedian and a friend to Craig Murray, who's writing this article. Stone tried to browbeat my friend Randy Credico into backing up his tale, his story. The Guardian has, in a feat of some skill, contrived to give its readers the impression that Stone has been convicted for Trump WikiLeaks links, when that is in fact the precise opposite of the truth. Stone has been convicted for fabricating, making up, the existence of Trump WikiLeaks links, of which there were none. In a reasonable world, he'd be a figure of fun. We'd be laughing at him. The Guardian has hung its entire corporate personality on Clinton identity politics. Note the arrangements with, or the similarities to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Guardian has hung its entire corporate personality on Clinton identity politics and its entire financial survival on building a new online customer base among the Clinton electorate in the USA. It's a very interesting point, and certainly we've seen plenty of evidence of that over the years, but I've never heard the point made quite so clearly. When even the New York Times had to admit the Mueller report utterly failed to substantiate Hillary Clinton's inane claims that the Russians had caused Clinton's election defeat, even when a judge dismissed the DNCs, the Democratic National Committees, all sued against said Russians as being supported by no viable evidence whatsoever, even when the entire world derided the Guardian's massive front-page lie about Paul Manafort visiting Assange in the embassy, the Guardian has persisted in reporting as fact the preposterous conspiracy theory that its heroine, Hillary Clinton, was thwarted from attaining supreme power by the evil machinations of Vladimir Putin. You had to be there to believe this stuff. To maintain this stance in the face of all factual evidence requires great skill and dexterity from Guardian journalists, and New York Times and Washington Post journalists too. Fortunately for the Guardian, it does not lack for fantasist Russophobe fabricators, who last week wrote of Stone that, quote, he was the sixth former Trump aide to be convicted in cases arising from the special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, close quote. The oleaginous David Smith, that's a British journalist, omitted to note what any half-honest human being would consider a very pertinent fact, that not one of those convictions had anything at all to do with Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, being either entirely unrelated tax and corruption matters turned up while trawling, or as with Stone, being questions of process, lying to the FBI. Stone's case is unique in that not only did his conviction not relate to any Russian interference, it was for promoting precisely the same ludicrous fantasy that The Guardian, New York Times, and Washington Post are promoting. It was illegal for Stone to persist in telling his lies under oath. There is no legal bar to The Guardian promoting the same Trump WikiLeaks Russia fantasy ad nauseum. Yet we have the spectacle of Julian Assange standing before a judge facing extradition to the United States and up to 175 years in jail for espionage, when everything WikiLeaks has ever published has a 100% record for truth and accuracy. To finish with Stone, the ludicrous vindictiveness of the prosecutors, the Department of Justice and judge in the U.S., in the Stone case, in pushing for a 7 to 9 year jail sentence for an offense that was really no more than wasting investigators' time with his fantasies, was rightly called out by Donald Trump. The notion that Roger Stone threatened witnesses is problematical. Randy Credico, the only person Stone was convicted of threatening, has written to the judge asking for Stone not to be jailed and making plain he did not feel threatened. He'd known Stone for years and was used to his blustering talk, which Randy never took as intended to be a serious threat. Randy Credico is this American comedian, literally a comedian. That's how he makes money. That's what I'm talking about. To consider those DNC leaks published by WikiLeaks, in which Roger Stone claimed falsely to have a part. What the leaks did reveal was the foul play and machinations of the DNC machinery in cheating Bernie Sanders out of the nomination, including jiggling the ordering of primaries specifically to give Hillary momentum and giving Hillary debate questions in advance. Nobody should be surprised to see the same tactics being deployed against Bernie Sanders, whom I should be clear, I support strongly, writes the author of this, Greg Murray, yet again. The muddle that led to CIA-linked Pete Buttigieg being able to claim victory in Iowa for a crucial 5 days before the official tallies showed Bernie had in fact won was, I strongly suspect, merely a portent of what is to come. The fact the app that misfired, in quotes, was designed by 4 ex-Clinton staffers, this is in the Iowa caucuses, working for a company chaired by a Buttigieg team member, is indicative of what we can expect over the next few months. The right have yet to decide on their champion to thwart Bernie. This was written before the emergence of Bloomberg, but it's not clear that Bloomberg emergence is going to last long, so we don't know. Buttigieg and Klobuchar are enjoying moments in the sun of media approval, and the DNC have now changed the rules to allow Bloomberg into future debates. That the Clintonites who have been deriding Sanders as not a Democrat will actually switch to support Republican billionaire Bloomberg against Sanders is something I expect to see play out over the next month as it becomes clear that neither Buttigieg nor Klobuchar can stop Bernie. I hope he's right. Here in the UK, I predict Bloomberg supporting Guardian editorials very soon. Still more sinister, the Zionist propaganda machine has started to ramp up its attacks on Bernie. In Iowa, the AIPAC-linked Democrats pressure group, quote, called Democratic Majority for Israel, sprayed money on TV ads attacking Bernie. It's a sign of the times that Bernie Sanders, bidding to become the first Jewish president of the United States, is attacked and undermined by extreme Zionists because of his entirely reasonable views on Israel and Palestine. Despite all of which, opinion polls show Bernie with a clear lead heading towards the Nevada primary. I remain, Craig Murray writes, cautiously hopeful that the degree of cheating required to stop Bernie gaining the nomination would simply be too much to hide, he's an optimist, and that the WikiLeaks DNC revelations may ultimately, by showing up the dirty tricks last time, help Bernie to power this time. We should, however, never underestimate the resources of the financiers and the security state which will be deployed against Bernie in the next few months. It's going to be a fascinating year in U.S. politics. Either the Democrats will pick a right-wing standard-bearer and lose to Trump, or Bernie will become president. I do not share the general fatalism of the left, which deems the latter impossible. That's Craig Murray talking about the Roger Stone case in the context of the upcoming presidential election. It seems to me he's a bit over optimistic. If I had to bet it right now, I would suggest that the Clintonite Democratic National Committee will find a way to eliminate Bernie, and that he will not be the Democratic nominee. But we shall see.
The word eliminate has
Particularly for the Clintons.
mafia-esque connotations.
Well, there is
He's
that
had his heart attack already, so
there is that long theme in American politics going back to Vincent Foster in the early days of the emergence of the Clintons about the suspicion that the Clinton organization, the Clinton campaigns, are responsible for illegal demises in various places. One of the first stories we did, as a matter of fact, on News from Neptune on the radio, was an account of the, quote, suicide, close quote, it may well have been a suicide, of Vincent Foster, Hillary Clinton's associate in her law firm. If he was killed in a parking lot, as it were, overlooking the Potomac, about a mile from where I grew up. A parking lot was a favorite spot for high school parkers,
kind of the Mulholland Drive of the Washington
something
area.
to be something like that. There were questions raised about whether it was murder or suicide at the time, but the theme of the Clintons being responsible for for convenient demises has turned up in recent discussions.
So the conventional wisdom about going all the way back to that, what you're referring to, was that Bill Clinton had to appeal to the white working class that had been lost, the so-called Reagan Democrats, and he successfully did so by upbraiding the black community in various ways, including a very famous incident called the Sister Soldier moment. Mm-hmm. And that conventional wisdom still has some life in it in terms of those who claim that that the Democrats have to be moderate, in their of various New York Times and I'm sure other like Washington Post columnists, that the Democrats have to be moderate in appealing not to Reagan Democrats anymore, but to Trump voters, to the famous white working class or the famous white nationalist racist working class, depending on how you want to put it. That rhetoric has sort of lost. It has back when Clinton was pursuing this vote, he was obliged to distance himself from people like Jesse Jackson. Sanders is in a similar predicament, one might argue, but at the same time, the Democratic base, it's become more clear since then that the liberal Democratic base is what's called the professional managerial class. And this includes people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, who tend to be affluent, obviously, and this consists of people arguing that this group consists of the kind of Warren base of the that's going on in the Democratic Party now, and the dilemma that Bernie Sanders faces is, on the one hand, to appeal in an obvious way, in an obvious non-racist way, to the so-called Trump Democrats or the formerly Reagan Democrats, while at the same time appealing to the, to put it in a way that I know you don't like, Carl, the Brooklyn hipsters,
some of my best friends,
the PMC, the professional some of your best friends, and perhaps even children, I guess.
Exactly.
Professional managerial class and the sort of identitarian politics, approach, and I think there are dangers in there are dangers in that for Bernie Sanders, and the data that was researched by Benjamin Studebaker on a recent What's Left podcast showed that Bernie Sanders had actually done in New Hampshire. Bernie Sanders had actually done less well than he had in the primary 4 years ago against Hillary Clinton in certain more rural, white, poorer counties, and better in the sort of urban university town type places where you have these sort of more identitarian, more PMC type voters. And the danger there is that Bernie, the danger it relates to both the manner in which the primaries play out, and of course as well as to how the general election versus Trump might play out if Sanders were to win the Democratic nomination. The big danger I see, and that Benjamin, I agree with Benjamin Studebaker on this, is that Sanders is under too much pressure to attract the frou-frou people, the identitarian college town, Black Lives Matter type of people, versus the working class, generally speaking.
The woke as opposed to the workers.
Yeah, as opposed to the woke as opposed to workers. Good one, Carl. Can I use that?
Unfortunately, you may have occasion to.
You could be a worker who's woke, but if you're having bread, if you having trouble putting bread on your table, you're going to be more concerned about work than woke.
Wasn't it George Bush the Younger who said people have trouble putting bread on their families?
Yeah.
I wonder what the subtext of that is.
Well,
given the various meanings of bread.
George Romney or Mitt Romney had trouble putting women in binders. And
yeah. Block that subtext. There's an article by Robert Scheer, who edits Truthdig and has been writing since for about 30 years, this week, entitled "The Clinton Machine Will Do Anything to Stop Bernie Sanders." And at our earlier discussion, quite what that anything includes, it may include anything, is another issue. But the article is about the political situation in which the Clinton, who we thought was dead and buried with a stake through her heart at midnight, nevertheless stalks the land once again. Scheer writes, "The botched Iowa caucuses have raised many legitimate questions about the Democratic establishment. But to understand the point we're at now, it's necessary to think back several years. According to Gray Zone journalist and editor Max Blumenthal, part of the backlash Bernie Sanders is currently experiencing as he attempts to transform the Democratic Party dates back to Bill Clinton's presidency. Bill and Hillary Clinton set up a machine that was really a juggernaut with all this corporate money they brought in through the Democratic Leadership Committee," says Blumenthal. "It was a very different structure than we'd seen with previous Democratic candidates who relied heavily on unions and the Civil Rights Coalition." What he's talking about here is the shift that the Clinton presidency represented in the Democratic Party from being the working man's party, at least in terms of its self-advertisement, to being the Wall Street Party. That was an epochal change, a change that was not unprepared for, so to speak. It had been growing in many ways with the rise of neoliberalism from the 1970s, from the Carter administration, but it did indeed change the Democratic Party and produce the emergence of the deplorable candidate, Hillary Clinton.
Let's just recall for one moment, though, that Ross Perot's populist campaign basically siphoned off enough populist votes from George Bush in 1992 to give it to Clinton. I mean, there was that dynamic also. It's complicated, I know, but...
And that dynamic has been recalled recently by a group of to my mind, quite unlikely people telling the Green Party to go away in the next presidential election because they might siphon off votes from the Democratic nominee, whoever he or she is, running against Donald Trump, who will probably be the be the Republican nominee. I was actually rather shocked by that, by the open letter by Noam Chomsky and a number of his associates saying the Greens should sit down and shut up.
So I'm sorry, I might have interrupted your train of thought there.
In so long as we have a train of thought going, jump aboard.
Bill Clinton pulled that off in '92 because of to a certain extent, because of his appeal to the Reagan Democrats, because his distancing from what is now seen as the sort of African American base, or one of the bases of the Democratic Party. That now it's sort of become the African American, Latino immigrant, et cetera, or first generation immigrant or second generation immigrant base of the Democratic Party. Obama was able to sort of transform that and appeal to enough, after 8 years of George W. Bush, appeal to enough white people, and of course shore up the minority base, which of course is still mostly working class, while at the same time incorporating Wall Street and the PMC as the base, the woke PMC, the identitarian PMC as the base of the Democratic Party. And then by the time Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump, she won the votes for sure. I mean, she had enough. She got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but she'd lost she had on the one hand not attracted enough African American support in key states, and not attracted enough white working class support in key states. So these are very delicate things, and what Bernie Sanders is busy doing is cutting through a lot of crap and basically saying, if you're working class, I'm for you. And his message is so different than any of the other Democratic candidates, including Warren, as much as people try to assert that Warren is just sort of Bernie light. It's not working. Warren's desperate. She's so desperate that apparently, I haven't followed this closely, that apparently she's inching a little closer to Sanders on the Medicare for All program, trying to pretend like she really is for Medicare for All in the Sanders style, which she's really not, and she really won't be. And she made very clear during the early debates and early primaries that she wasn't, she was doing her framework, and that within the framework you were going through steps, But Bernie's been very clear about that, and as long as those contrasts are heightened, and as long as Bernie Sanders, as we move forward, doesn't cater too much to identity politics, I think there's a good chance that he will continue to do well. I mean, I'm cautiously guarded, as I think a lot of people are, but the polls are pretty firm right now regarding that.
I think you're right, and I think that suggests the possibility of even more extreme measures by the Clintonites and the Democratic National Committee and so forth to make sure that that Sanders is not the nominee. These people, the people in charge of the Democratic Party right now, notably the people around the Clinton tradition, if you want to put it that way, in the Democratic Party, these people are desperate to make sure that Sanders not become the representative of the party, so desperate that they will do what they can to make sure that Trump is reelected if it comes down to be a Sanders versus Trump election. Sanders is more of a threat to the interests that are running the Democratic Party right now than Trump is. And they will behave accordingly, and they won't worry too much about legality in doing it, as perhaps the Iowa caucuses show.
Yeah, and you can see on the New York Times editorial page all the usual suspects.
Yep.
Eliding the meaning of Sanders' popularity. Paul Krugman,
Yes.
Frank Bruni, and of course David Brooks.
Yep.
I mean, you expect it from David
Right.
Brooks, but and the person who goes all the way back to Clinton, because he wrote a famous book about the Bill Clinton campaign, or about the Bill Clinton strategy that I referred to before, Thomas Edsall, is basically saying the same thing now as he was 30 years ago. He's basically talking about how talking in these conventional terms about the extremes of the Democratic Party and what happens when extremist primary victors enter into the general election against supposedly less extremist Donald Trump, whatever that would mean. It just gets crazy. The definition of terms, the rhetoric, the sort of the use of the word ideological in a way that's unreflectively ideological from the people who are writing it. Mm-hmm. Like Thomas Edsall doesn't have an ideology, right?
Right.
Everybody else does. He's just a moderate.
Right. Exactly.
And you get to define these extremes, meaning sort of white nationalism on the one hand and socialism on the other hand. And are Americans going to buy into that? Or are they going to be confused by that? What's the level of voter turnout going to be among usual non-voters, among so-called disenfranchised voters? It's getting a little exciting. So tomorrow is Saturday. The Nevada primaries, the Nevada caucuses are tomorrow. There's been all kinds of drama around health care. Very, very telling. Very revealing. Understanding in terms of how union leadership works. The Culinary Workers Union, which of course is very powerful in the tourist industry, the tourist industry-oriented economy in Nevada. The high support for Sanders among culinary workers, among probably dominantly Latino culinary workers, or certainly dominant minority culinary workers, telling them they're union leaders, they're corrupt union leaders who were beholden to the healthcare corporations, trying to scare workers off, thinking they're going to lose their union-based health insurance. The best thing that could happen. And I give a shout out to our friends at the World Labor Hour for this. The best thing that could happen would be to take healthcare negotiations out of union bargaining.
Yes,
union
exactly.
bargaining. These should be basic rights. Union bargaining should be about workplaces and hiring practices and seniority systems and occupational safety and relationships between managers and workers. They shouldn't be about health care. They shouldn't be about, they should be about how much people get paid, but the minimum wage issue should be taken out of that, meaning there should be a much higher minimum wage to start with. All this obvious stuff that everybody who's watching this show understands perfectly well.
Our friend Doug Henwood writes this week that the much touted Culinary Workers Union in Nevada that has been cited by opponents of Sanders as being opposed to Sanders' health care, Medicare for all, in fact has a health plan for its members that really is not very good at all. And the notion that culinary workers don't want to give up this wonderful health care health care plan that they have under a Medicare for All system is pure propaganda. What they have is not that good at all. It's exactly what you were just describing. Mm-hmm. And Henwood is the first one I've seen who apparently has looked at the details of the plan or talked to somebody who has looked at those details and has described the situation that's being used against Sanders.
Where is Bugsy Siegel when we need him?
Unfortunately, that may take us back to the Clinton campaign.
Yeah, right. So I'm going to veer off here just a little bit.
Veer off, David.
Yeah.
We have nothing to veer but veer itself,
really,
right?
Yeah, right. So a couple of Jacobin references here. One from Matt Brunig, who runs the People's Policy Project.
Funny, I was just going to mention his wife.
Okay, well, they have a very entertaining podcast, although Matt suffers from a persistent cough in the winter, so his voice isn't what it usually is. But he was really angry about some stuff, and you can listen to that on their most recent podcast. He writes an article on Jacobin called "Michael Bloomberg has 6 times more wealth than the bottom 125 million Americans." Michael Bloomberg's net worth is $64.2 billion, according to Forbes. This makes him the 8th wealthiest person in this country. Wealth at that scale is hard to comprehend, and so it can be useful to compare it to something else. And if you are trying to highlight the high level of inequality in the country, the best thing to compare it is to the wealth held by those at the bottom of our society. Every 3 years, the Federal Reserve releases its survey of consumer finances, which is the best household wealth survey in the country. In the latest SCF data, the bottom 38% of American households have a collective net worth of $11.4 billion. And I want to emphasize billion, not because that's a lot, but because that's not very much. What other Federal Reserve data shows is that the collective household wealth, total household wealth, is over 100 trillion. Okay, so that's a trillion is 1,000 billion. So the total household wealth in this country is over 100,000 billion. 100,000 billion, and the bottom 38%, more than 1/3, have only 11.4 billion of that 100,000 billion, okay? And that 38% is important as a kind of dividing line. Usually what you'll see is that the bottom 50% have about 1.3 trillion. So you see, even if you add that next 12%, that adds over $1 trillion to that bottom half, whereas those bottom 38% are stuck with basically nothing. Bruna goes on, the bottom 38% of households is equal to 47.8 million households. Since households have an average of 2.63 members, this is equal to about 125.7 million people. So when you take those 125 million men, women, and children and divide their $11.4 billion up, what you get for that bottom 38% is $90 per person. $90 of wealth per person, as opposed to $64.2 billion for Michael Bloomberg, and obviously a lot, even more money for Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and the whole gang. Mark Zuckerberg, don't forget Mark. Thus, Bloomberg's wealth is near, okay. So, Brunig goes on, in fact, this 125 million actually understates how lopsided things are. The definition of wealth used in the official SCF publications includes cars as wealth. But academics that study wealth inequality, like Edward Wolff, often do not count cars as wealth because they are rapidly
you need
depreciating
one.
consumer. Pardon?
Nothing.
Because you need to drive them.
Right.
Depreciating consumer durables that most
Right.
people can't really sell for the practical reason that they need a car to get around and live.
Right.
When you exclude cars from the, this is getting very wonky, but I like this
But
stuff.
this is, yeah.
When you exclude cars from the definition of wealth, what you find is that the bottom 48% of households have less combined wealth than Michael Bloomberg does. This is 64 million households, or 159 million people. Regardless of what measure you use, the upshot is clear. The United States is simultaneously home to some of the wealthiest people on earth and to a large property-less underclass of people that have scarcely a penny to their names. And that's quite literal. Now, if you took that 125 million people that he referred to before, of course, even among those people, you would have some wealth, some few $1,000s of wealth, even beyond cars, mostly equity in a home or something like that. But what you would have among probably half of those people is debt, is at least no
Money in the bank.
net assets,
Yeah.
and probably net debts. And as I like to say in sort of graphic terms, start on Windsor Road, over around, go down Windsor Road between Prospect and Mattis and go up and down Galen Avenue and look at the wealth management and look at the banks and look at the asset management. Then drive 3 or 4 miles up North Prospect and look at the payday loans and look at the title loans and look at the rent-a-center. And that's America. And I really think that those, even the top 50% of people, even that say people from 50 to 25 who've got something, don't quite understand how little money a third of the people have, or how no money, how the utter lack of wealth, and how the hand to mouth, the nature of the hand to mouth and precarious existence of at least 40% of the people. Even looking at it in terms of the bottom 50% kind of hides that to a certain extent, because the bottom 50% has about $1 trillion, but the bottom 38% has 11 billion. that's 11 versus 1,000. So that's 1% of that whole trillion.
And what people forget, it was this lack of wealth in the way that you've described it, David, that elected Donald Trump. That's what's at stake going forward. Not deplorables. It's not even racism, although obviously there is racism.
Yeah.
That accounts for this. It's the situation that you've just outlined, and that's what the American political establishment has to cover over. It has to convince some people in this country, voters, that something else is at stake, from Russian machinations to racial discrimination, in order to account for the emergence of Donald Trump and their attempt to counter it. We'll see if they manage it. I rather think they won't. But what will happen when they don't? That's not clear at all.
Just one more paragraph here.
Okay, go ahead.
Just to conclude the Jacobin portion of the and I'm not the biggest fan of Jacobin always, but I think they do a general good job.
Jacobin is a journal that you can get some online.
Yeah,
Right?
it's a little confusing because on the one hand we're observing the 65th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. No, I'm sorry, 55th. 55th, and there's talk about Malcolm X, and I have some issues with that. And I have some issues with that in the whole context of the 1619 project that we've been talking about. But Frederick Douglass has also been sort of coming up lately. A fellow named Matt Karp, a historian, has unearthed some statements or writings that Douglass made, and those are interesting to refer to. One paragraph here that relates to obviously what I've just been saying. Frederick Douglass, the primary black African American leader obviously in this country in the 1800s. Quote, "We are ready to grant that the condition of man, cast as he is," and of course he's using the male, the male gender of the time, "cast as he is into the world naked and surrounded by elements unfriendly to his continued existence, renders a degree of acquisitiveness necessary for the security of life. But is it just to plead this moderate degree of accumulation indicated by nature?" This is a very Marxist thing, by the way. "Indicated by nature in justification of the unlimited hoarding of wealth and monopolies of land, which has converted almost the entire civilized world into an abode of millionaires and beggars, which renders the enslavement of the peoples of the world possible." And he's probably saying this after slavery was over in this country. "And shrouds the future of liberty with gloom?" Question mark. Pretty powerful stuff. Pretty powerful quasi-Marxist stuff coming from Frederick Douglass in the later part, in the post-Civil War era, I think, and in stark contrast to the kind of argument that's being made, for example, in the 1619 Project, the New York Times 1619 Project.
We've got to remember that Frederick Douglass and Karl Marx were pretty close contemporaries, and they're talking about the 19th century capitalist world, and it's worthwhile for us to realize, as it were, where we came from. One statistic provided by our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, that refers to the accounts you've just been giving, David, struck me particularly. Jeff points out it takes more working now to earn as much salary as one did in 1985. Major household expenditures are all, and those cars too, by the way, are all more expensive now. In 1985, which seems like just yesterday to me, but still, in 1985, the typical male worker could cover a family of four's major expenditures, housing, health care, transportation, education, on 30 weeks a year of salary. That's what it took to live in 1985 on the average. In 2018, it took 53 weeks. You may remember there's only 52 weeks in the year. But the point is that to cover a family's four major expenditures, housing, healthcare, transportation, education, one had to work for 30 weeks of the year in 1985. Now you can't do it in 52 weeks of the year. Indeed, you need 53 weeks of the year to come up to an equivalent status. This suggests the sort of immiseration of making poor that the American economy has done, as it were, almost in spite of the figures of how much you're earning, what the median wage is, and so forth and so on. The actual economic circumstances means that the American worker the American family has gotten substantially poor in the last 35 years. That's happens to be the years that I've lived in this town, by the way, so I don't know whether I'm not pulling my weight or what, but the fact of the matter is that's the real situation, and as I say, that's the situation that produced Donald Trump as president, not Russian machinations or the peculiar development of American deplorableness.
Yes, and let me I got to get one. I had wanted to make more extended remarks, but we don't really have too much time, so I just want to mention at least. Sundiata Shajua wrote a column in this past Sunday's News Gazette called "Solving the Schooling Crisis." It refers to data that we talked about on this show a few weeks ago, that I wrote a letter about a few weeks ago, regarding my concerns about sort of the racialization of understanding educational achievement, et cetera. I think this is a bad column. I think it's a wrong column. I think it's kind of a dumb column, talking about what Sundiata feels needs to be done in Unit 4 schools, although I'm not even sure why Unit 4 is being singled out, because I can't imagine the data regarding black and white children is any different in the Urbana school district, and it's probably worse. But regardless, he talks about miseducation. He talks about these problems are historic and persistent. Undereducation, which is often referred to as the achievement gap, refers to black students missing grade-level educational benchmarks in reading and math. Miseducation denotes the near exclusion of knowledge about African and African American histories, cultures, and perspectives from the K-12 curriculum. Overpunishment addresses black students' subjection to disproportionate suspensions, expulsions, and other disciplinary measures. These problems are intractable, he writes, not insolvable. I would say the last of those three things is at least real. I don't see that the exclusion of knowledge about African and African American histories in Unit 4 is even a thing, and one can spend 5 minutes in any Unit 4 school walking up and down the hallways or being in any classroom and wonder, what is this man talking about? I'm there every day. I'm there 4 days a week. This is the only day I don't, because I like to come in here. Yeah. But no, there's more I want to say about this, but the fabrication, the fact that Sundiata doesn't know that there is a extraordinary emphasis on African American history and figures. And yes, we can talk about history. I'm not sure why he feels that children are so interested in history. A few of them are, most of them aren't. But the material is there, and the ones that are interested in it and want to identify with it and want to know something about the background of their own people, they're perfectly encouraged to find out about those things through books, through videos. Fifth grade teacher I work with uses Eyes on the Prize. This isn't a secret, so I don't know where he's getting this stuff. And when he says, when he talks about racial bias in Unit 4, he goes, the school environment is utterly white in its administrative and teaching staff, in its curriculum and extracurricular culture. What, you mean like sports? The percentage of African American administrators and teachers represent a dismal reflection of the district's black student percentage. Unit 4 has failed to reorient its curriculum to incorporate African and African American histories, cultures, and perspectives to any meaningful extent. Hence, the miseducation of African American and all children continues. And then he talks about launching a massive program to recruit and hire African American teachers, administrators and staff. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, that's just, it's plain and simple. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And if Unit 4 people are not going to respond to this within the next week or two, I'm going to be shocked. But if they don't respond, it's because they're just avoiding conflict.
And we should point out that the people, particularly local people, whom we criticize on News from Neptune, have an invitation to come and respond if they would like. And this includes a number of people who write for the News Gazette, who are friends of David's. And
I especially like the letter this week from the person, referred to my most recent letter about the Kobe Bryant thing, saying, I wanted to write a letter responding to David Green, but I didn't understand what he was saying. Well, so then he went off and started talking about somebody else.
Even he is invited to come respond. David would be more than happy to explain what he was saying.
That was my laugh of the day. My laugh of the day. I'm sorry. I made it as plain as I could. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. Okay, that's it. Move on.
And we'll try to make ourselves clearer in future.
Yeah.
You've been watching News from Neptune.
No, we've still got, actually, Carl, we've got 5 minutes.
Well, go ahead.
Well, have you got something? No, I've been talking a blue streak here. You go. I mean, I would only conclude my comments by saying, Sundiata does refer to poverty. He does refer to social class, but only in passing. And this is the kind of disparitarian argument that Adolf Reed has been talking about for years. We need to be talking about class and not race. Race, the way this country historically has done exploitation is through racial exploitation, but it's less relevant now than it's ever been, and it's confusing to people when, on the one hand, we talk about sort of integrating schools as if that's going to do any good. I mean, that day has come and gone when we see that as a kind of a silver bullet. That's not going to happen. Okay, Sundiata's talking about a more Afrocentric approach. He needs to play these things out and not confuse people as to what he's really saying and what he really wants and how that's going to make people less poor. Because ultimately, you got to make people less poor. And I don't think anything he's saying has anything to do with that.
In the few minutes we have left, I think I might add a comment, once again, from our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, about another local figure, local not to this town, but to South Bend, Indiana, where I once lived. Mayor Pete, as he apparently has come to be called, Pete Buttigieg, who was mayor of the city of South Bend, is also a CIA asset, apparently. That's worth noting, particularly if the self-destruction of Mayor Bloomberg means that Buttigieg is the great white hope, no pun intended, of the Democratic Party. It's worthwhile to notice where his support comes from, and the answer is the, quote, intelligence community, close quote. While Buttigieg's campaign denies allegations that he was a CIA asset, military records reveal that Mayor Pete was in a unit that worked with the spy agency in Afghanistan. Interesting. The Gray Zone, a very worthwhile online publication, published an article about Buttigieg's roster of endorsements from CIA veterans and coup plotters, and another about his mysterious trips to Somaliland, alongside a friend who now works for a U.S. government regime change agency. Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign issued a public statement denying that he ever worked for the CIA. A lot contained in that, perhaps. Quote, "We hate to break the news to Twitter, but no, Pete was not in the CIA," close quote. Buttigieg's national press secretary derisively told the Daily Beast, which directly referenced both Gray Zone reports. As for the Somaliland trip, it was not related to his work anywhere. This is a non-denial denial, and it seems that indeed when we talk about Buttigieg, we're talking about the intelligence community's direct candidate for president, and indeed we should bear that in mind if in fact he does manage to edge out what Mini Mike, as Trump calls him, Mayor Bloomberg.
I was wondering why is it always naval intelligence and it's never Army intelligence?
It's an interesting point. I think the answer may be in a historic connection with the intelligence community.
I see.
There's a number that turns up frequently.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
And the person I just want to reference this. The person who really did the most work in exposing all these people, endorsing Buttigieg, was Kevin Gostola at the Shatterproof website, and his work was picked up by Jimmy Dore, and then to a certain extent by Gray Zone also.
You've been watching News from Neptune for February 21st, a Stone the Crows edition. See further notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, man of mystery. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett. And shall I be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.